Hello, everybody. I'm Howard Friedman. I'm the director of the Jewish Community Library in San Francisco, and I'm really glad to welcome all of you. I want to thank the Friends of the Jewish Community Library who make everything we do possible, and I hope you'll consider becoming a friend by giving at any level at friendsofthejcl.org. And today's program is made possible in part by Richard Krieg in honor of David Medlin. Please note that automated closed captioning for today's program can be turned on or off by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And we will all be muted, but you will have the opportunity to ask questions, which I hope you will, at the end. And you can do that through Zoom's chat function. You just put your questions in the chat and I'll relay them to our speaker, time permitting. We are so pleased to welcome Lillie Edwards to speak about the Jewish refugee scholars who found an academic home at historically Black colleges. Dr. Edwards served as the founding director of Pan-African Studies and as director of American Studies at Drew University before retiring in 2016. Prior to working at Drew, she taught at DePaul University, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Earlham College. She's a prominent public intellectual committed to bringing African American studies to adult audiences, and we are so glad to have her with us today, discussing a topic that I think many of us likely have little familiarity with. So Lillie, it is all yours.
Thank you so very much, Howard, and thank you to the entire staff and volunteers and supporters of the Jewish Community Museum. I am honored to contribute to the library. I mean, not museum, to the library's mission. Quote, to cover the entire range of Jewish topics and perspectives reflecting the diversity of the Jewish people. Let me begin sharing my screen as I enter into our presentation for today. So let's begin. I heard about this topic for the first time when my colleagues at the Drew University Genocide and Holocaust Center in 1999 presented a lecture by Dr. Joyce Ladner, who was one of the students of one of the refugee professors. And since then, I've had numerous opportunities to share this history, not as the original researcher, but as a modern day chronicler, ensuring that Gabrielle Simon Edgecombe's research continues to be inspired, continues to inspire um, empathy, resilience, courage, and hope of the refugee scholars and that of the Black colleges and communities where they worked. The late Gabrielle Simon Edgecombe published From Swastika to Jim Crow, Refugee Scholars at Black Colleges in 1993. Her book became the scholarly foundation for the documentary film of the same title, directed by Martin Cheadle and Lori Taub and produced by Stephen Fischler and Joel Susher. I'll be able to show you just a tiny excerpt from the film at the end of this lecture. In the documentary film, the former students and the faculty describe what it was like for the Black academic community to welcome these refugee scholars and what it was like for the German Jewish professors and their families to acclimate to Black colleges and universities located in the South, where everyone's life was shaped and defined by segregation and racial discrimination. The book and the film are based on the experiences of 51 refugee scholars from Germany and Austria who came to the United States in the 1930s and 1950s and held faculty positions at 51 historically Black colleges and universities, all in the South. This is a story of how oppression and resilience connected across faith and place, connecting Dusseldorf, Hanover, and Leipzig to Tougaloo, Mississippi, Talladega, Alabama, and Greensboro, North Carolina. In the preface of her book, Edgecombe quotes refugee scholar Professor Ernst Manassi, who taught German, Latin, and philosophy at North Carolina Central University in Durham, North Carolina, for 34 years, from 1939 to 1973, and whose wife, the artist Marianne Bernard Manassi, taught German there as well. Professor Manassi says of their experience teaching at a Black college, and I quote him here: whereas a number of people are inclined to say friendly things about the contributions we refugee scholars made to the growth and development of several predominantly Black colleges, both my wife and I felt that the experiences we made at these institutions changed and enriched our lives in significant ways, both intellectually and emotionally. The Manasseh's description of their lives at a Black college in the segregated South suggests a reciprocal and shared empathy between their life story and that of their Black students, colleagues, and the Black community of Durham, North Carolina. By empathy here, I mean acting on the desire and curiosity to know, understand, and share more deeply another person's history. By empathy, I mean providing a space for compassion and solace where voices and stories are heard and respected. Empathy includes offering salvation or protection from harm. Empathy includes redressing harm through restitution, apologies, legal remedies, and policy changes aimed at addressing an injustice. Empathy includes healing and rebuilding relationships through reconciliation, communication, forgiveness, and addressing the root causes of the conflict. And finally, empathy inspires hope, which Dr. Brian Lawler of the Global Brain Institute in Dublin, Ireland, described in this way, and I quote him here. Quote is hope is all about imagining and reaching for a better future for ourselves. Hope is both an emotion and a way of thinking. We experience it in our brain, but it comes from somewhere or someone else. Hope is crucial in times of uncertainty and in dealing with adversity. And so today I invite you to join me in this journey to explore the empathy, salvation, redress, healing, and hope that refugee scholars like the Manassehs found at Black colleges in the South. But in order to understand the significance of this history, we must acknowledge the historical context of anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism. The British North American colonies and the United States constructed Blackness as inferior and subhuman to rationalize buying and selling African people as human cargo for over 400 years and violence against Black bodies. And although Black freedom and citizenship were guaranteed by the Civil Rights Acts of 1866 and 1875, and by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the US Constitution following the Civil War, white supremacy sought to re-enslave Black people through intimidation, lynching, ritual violence, and rape, through disenfranchisement, through scientific racism, through legal segregation and discrimination in housing, jobs, public accommodations, and education, and to validate those through the kinds of racial stereotypes you see on the screen. So in response to these forms of institutionalized racism, the Black community organized its own institutions: independent Black churches, banks, settlement houses, and orphanages, newspapers and journals, social clubs and civic organizations, civil rights organizations, and most importantly for our purposes today, schools and colleges. Historically, Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, were founded on the principle that literacy and education were the keys to liberation. The Higher Education Act of 1965 defined historically Black colleges and universities as any historically Black college or university that was established prior to 1964, whose principal mission was and is the education of Black Americans, and that is accredited by a nationally recognized agency or association. All but four of the of the HBCUs were founded after the Civil War by African American and white denominations, by the of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, better known as the Freedmen's Bureau, by African American and white private founders, and by the Second Morrill Land Grant Act of 1890. The HBCU private schools' core curriculum reflected a liberal arts traditional education of their founders, many of whom were from New England. And that curriculum included natural sciences, humanities, classics, Greek, Latin, French, and German, the subject areas represented by most of the refugee professors. And now we come to the year 1933. Four key events in the year 1933 will help us connect these centuries of anti-Black racism and Black community institutional organizing to global and national events that bring refugee scholars to HBCU campuses in the 1940s and 50s. These will include book burnings, the university expulsions, anti-Semitism in Germany, and lynchings and pro-Nazi anti-Semitism in the United States. On May 10th, 1933, the Nazi German student organization, having called for a literary purge of all works deemed un-German, burned over 25,000 volumes in 34 university cities. And I have the map here in part to show you that this is in cities in every part of Germany. Thousands gathered in public places with students, Nazi party officials, and police. In the fervor of these ritual cultural cleansings, student leaders swore an oath by the fire to combat un-German literature and continue to confiscate a growing number of works, 80,000 to 90,000 books. A little over a week after these book burnings, on Friday, May 19th, 1933, the Manchester Guardian Weekly collected information from the German press and reported that 183 university professors had been dismissed from German universities between April 13th and May 4th. The paper noted, and I quote, "Most of the professors have been dismissed because of their Jewish origin, a few because of their liberal sentiments." Professor Michael Grutner of the Technical University of Berlin examined the biographies of 1,300 university teaching staff expelled between 1933 and 1945, and writes in the Journal of Contemporary History, "An analysis of the reasons for their dismissal shows that approximately 80% were driven out on anti-Semitic grounds, even though less than a third belonged to the Jewish community." I ask now that you prepare to see in the next slide two pictures of actual lynchings as we move back to the American side and anti-Black racism, still in the year 1933. In the same year as the book burnings, 1933, and over 4,000 miles away from the Nazi book burnings and university expulsions, 24 Black people were lynched in what was by then a decades-old pattern of systemic, racist, vigilante violence against Black freedom. White supremacy cheered the murders of 6,500 Black men, women, and children between 1865 and 1950. Lynchings, in particular, were sometimes ritualized public murders that included cutting off body parts or burning a victim alive. People brought their children, posed for pictures, and took souvenirs. And these ritualized statements that Black lives did not matter. Also, in 1933, William Dudley Pelley founded the anti-Semitic organization, the Silver Shirt Legion of America, which had a peak membership of 15,000 members in only 2 years. Father Charles Coughlin's weekly radio program in the 1930s and 40s had 5 to 12 million listeners and a newspaper with a circulation of 800,000. Both of his media spewed virulent anti-Semitic theories, blamed Jewish bankers for the Depression, the Russian Revolution, and communism. They supported Hitler, supported Nazi Germany, and justified Kristallnacht as a kind of divine retribution. The German-American Bund, organized in 1936, had 25,000 dues-paying members and 8,000 stormtroopers capable of a full public display of anti-Semitic pro-Nazi Americanism, with 20,000 people in Madison Square Garden on George Washington's birthday in 1939. Charles Lindbergh, Henry Ford, and other public figures led anti-Semitic campaigns. The America First Committee, founded in 1940, and with 800,000 dues-paying members, among them corporate CEOs, politicians, and civic leaders, blamed Jews for encouraging President Roosevelt to enter the war. The American right wing's anti-Semitism imagined Jewish hegemony in media and government, advocated limiting Jewish influence on American institutions and governance, and sought to limit the percentage of Jews in the population. For example, decades earlier, American immigration laws in 1921 and 24 had already targeted Jews and Catholics by restricting immigration except from Northern and Western Europe. Laura Delano Hoteling, a cousin of President Franklin Roosevelt and the wife of the U.S. Commissioner of Immigration, expressed the sentiments of an anti-Semitic America at a Washington dinner party in the spring of 1939, when a State Department official asked her why she opposed the Wagner-Rogers bill to admit 20,000 German Jewish children outside of the quota system. He jotted in his diary that she had replied, quote, 20,000 charming children would all too soon grow up into 20,000 ugly adults. Paley, Coughlin, Lindbergh, Ford, Hoteling, and others were not outliers so much as they were mirrors that reflected widespread American anti-Semitism among the working, middle, and professional classes in every region of the nation, in government and social organizations, in popular culture and media caricatures, jokes, and songs, and in white American colleges and universities. In his 1971 article for Commentary magazine, How Jewish Quotas Began, Steven Steinberg includes this highly racist, anti-Semitic college song from the 19-teens. And it goes, oh, Harvard's run by millionaires and Yale is run by booze. Cornell is run by farmers' sons. Columbia is run by Jews. So give a cheer for Baxter Street, another one for Pell, and when the little blank die, their souls will go to hell. In 1922, Harvard's president, Abbott Lawrence Lowell, began publicly discussing quotas for Jewish students. New admissions criteria reduced Jewish admissions from cities with large populations in the name of regional diversity and reduced the significance and weight of academic achievement. At the same time, Harvard institutionalized a preference for legacies that favored admitting white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men. And nationwide, other white institutions adopted this policy. In his book, Extracted: Unmasking Rampant Anti-Semitism in America's Higher Education, published in 2019, Dr. S. Perry Brickman describes how Jewish students in his 1950s dental school classes at Emory University were systematically failed with the with the dental school dean telling one Jewish student, and I quote, "I could flunk you or pass you, but to tell you the truth, I don't know why you Jews want to be dentists. You don't have it in your hands." End quote. According to Dr. Brickman's book, while the failure rate of non Jewish dental students in that era was 15.4%, 64.5% of Jews either failed or were required to repeat a year. By establishing quotas on the number of Jewish students and faculty, white colleges and universities embraced and institutionalized the same anti Semitism as the Ku Klux Klan, the German American Bund, the Silver Shirts, and America First. In its 2002 book, The Jews and the Nation, scholar Frederick Kopel Jayer shows that as Jewish scholars, intellectuals, and jurists rose in prominence in the 1940s to be, quote, the first Jews in their fields and positions, in national surveys, 58% of respondents in 1945 agreed that Jews had too much power in the United States and that Jews were seen as a greater threat to the welfare of the United States than any other national, religious, or racial group. Thus, at the very time refugee professors are seeking asylum and academic appointments in the United States, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's lessons on this topic are clear. And this is what the museum says. One, during the 1930s and 40s, the State Department tolerated nativist, xenophobic, and often anti Semitic attitudes and actions before and during the war. And two, the Visa Department placed new restrictions on immigration due to national security concerns, even though it was clear that Jewish refugees in Europe were in serious danger. So, anti Semitism in the nation, in the State Department, in white colleges and universities, and anti Black racism that initially excluded HBCUs from consideration for these professors challenged philanthropic efforts to find academic positions for Jewish refugee scholars. The earliest efforts to help these exile professors reflected this complex mix of American anti Semitism on one hand, which I think I've established was deeply ingrained into American society. So, on one hand, you have anti Semitism, and on the other, you have American philanthropy. In 1933, less than 2 months after the expulsion of Jewish and liberal scholars from universities began, a Rockefeller Foundation's Special Research Aid Fund for Displaced Scholars devised a plan to prioritize which scholars would be assisted and placed according to their rank and status. They also devised a plan to limit the number of placements and the length of time for contracts, in part because they thought this emergency in Germany would itself be temporary. And they also sought to strategically navigate the challenge of Jewish quotas at white colleges and universities. With the Rockefeller Foundation providing the logistics for these placements, Jewish donors funded refugee scholars' first year salaries with matching contributions from 20 universities in 1933-34. Refugee scholars were specifically discouraged from taking positions at HBCUs because an elite higher education system deemed Black institutions to be inferior. In her book, Gabrielle Simon Edgecombe repeatedly points out that from 1933 to 1941, the refugee agencies ignored Black colleges and universities. When Howard University's Dean of the College of Liberal Arts wrote to the Emergency Committee in 1934, asking for information on employing displaced German scholars, he received No response. Refugee scholars who did find jobs at Black schools in the 1930s did so solely through word of mouth, through refugee networks, and through the American Friends Service Committee. Of the 51 in Edgecombe's study, only 13 joined faculty at Black colleges before 1941. By 1938, it was clear that the problem the Rockefeller Foundation and others had defined as a temporary emergency in 1933 was an urgent life or death horror. Awakened to the urgency of assisting refugees after the Nazi annexation of Austria in 1938 and the violence and terror of Kristallnacht also in 1938. The Rockefeller Foundation and others joined the established work of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, founded in 1914 to assist Jewish refugees. Ultimately, these joint efforts of a national coordinating committee included around 19 organizations, most of them Jewish, but also the American Friends Service Committee and the Federal Council of Churches, representing over 30 denominations. But even after 1938, when it's clear this is not temporary and it's a urgent emergency, the Rockefeller Foundation continued to limit the scope of its work with rigid criteria for Jewish scholars to qualify for the foundation's help. Scholars had to be outstanding in their field and in their productive years. They had to have lost their position and generally be considered to be in danger. They had to hold the promise of improving existing scholarship in the United States. And they had to have assurance of a teaching position for at least 2 years so that the foundation would not have to pay their salaries. Rockefeller and other relief organizations then reached out to colleges and universities, especially in 1938 and following. So, for example, the American Friends Service Committee interviewed 140 college presidents, deans, registrars, heads of departments, and found sympathy for refugees, concerned about the budgetary limitations for paying them, but they were also concerned about anti-German attitudes, xenophobia, and church schools were concerned about were specifically preferred having Christian, not Jewish refugees. In the 1940s and 50s, then these global and national events converge on Black college campuses, most of them in the South. The overt anti-Semitism, constructions of racism and xenophobia, public concern for Jews, especially following Kristallnacht, a nation that embraced both inequality and equality, American institutions that thrived both on meritocracy and privilege, and the Nazi purges and the Holocaust all come together and converge on Black college campuses. It connects the Black college campus to these domestic and global shifts in the United States and European history, and it illuminates human connections. The refugee scholars, Black college students, faculty, and communities, Jim Crow racial segregation and violence, anti-Semitism in the US and Europe, and of course, genocide under Nazi Germany. Edgecombe locates what she thinks is the first outreach to Black colleges, a 1941 letter from Lawrence R. Seeley to the presidents of 6 of the most renowned private Black colleges and universities: Fisk in Nashville, Hampton University in Virginia, Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina, Talladega College in Talladega, Alabama, Spelman in Atlanta, and Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina, both all-female institutions, and the internationally celebrated Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama. When approximately 2,000 Jewish refugee professors immigrated from Germany and Austria to the United States from the 1930s to the end of World War II, they first confronted the Great Depression's high unemployment and the long legacy of anti-Semitism and quotas that limited the number of Jewish students and faculty in America's white colleges and universities. But the doors of segregated Black colleges and universities opened to 51 of them, who discovered that HBCUs welcomed them into humanistic, optimistic spaces of empathy and hope. Of the 51 refugee scholars in Edgecombe's research and book, few stayed more than a few years in their Black college positions, while others spent their entire career at an HBCU. The post-war rapid growth in students going to college in the 1950s and the 1950s economic boom meant that many had opportunities to teach elsewhere in spite of anti-Semitism in white colleges and universities. There also appears to be, among these professors, no pattern or common characteristic among those who had the longest tenure of over 10 years. Many of them taught German, but that was true of almost all the refugee scholars. Otherwise, they were professors of sociology, economics, biology, home economics, social work, and art. The stories of the Jewish refugees who had the longest tenures at HBCUs and therefore had the most fulsome stories do give us some sense of their common experiences, which I will share with you now. As I said earlier, they were welcomed onto the Black college campus and into Black communities of the 1930s and 1950s as men and women of prestige, and with the very high status of being college professors. They were perceived more in this status than they were as Jews or German. They were respected because of their educational attainment and the value the Black community placed on education. Many of them also brought to these campuses training in multiple areas so they could teach a broad range of courses, such as French and German, and economics, sociology, and philosophy. Despite being welcomed, they lived on the margins of American Black, white, Southern, Christian, Protestant culture and historical context. Some lived in white neighborhoods, taught at Black colleges, but for the most part, they did have access to white race privilege by living in white neighborhoods, sitting at white only lunch counters, drinking water from whites only water fountains, sitting in the whites only section of movie theaters. Others lived in Black communities that surrounded most campuses, and some lived in faculty housing on Black campuses. Regardless of this kind of them trying to navigate this highly racialized space, they all confronted the daily dilemma of participating in or rejecting the white privilege afforded to them, like the Rasmussens pictured here, who were fined for eating at a Black cafe. They witnessed the racial segregation and its daily expressions, including what we would now call hate crimes. They were aware that, as Ruth Fales at Lincoln University says, and I quote, the KKK was 3 miles right down the road from the campus. The Fales family witnessed crosses being burned and cherry bombs thrown to attack and threaten Black families, including Lincoln University's president, Dr. Bond. I will quote here from Ruth Fales as she describes an experience of going to the movie theaters when she and her husband were at Lincoln University. I took my children to the cinema in Oxford, only to find out that the Blacks were only supposed to be in a particular place. I took my daughter and Marita, an African American girl, together to see a children's picture, and we sat together in the middle of the theater. Professor Frederick Lehner at West Virginia State College declined to go to the Modern Language Association annual meeting in New Orleans with his Black colleagues because he knew that he and his colleagues could not stay in the same hotel in New Orleans. These professors were also very cosmopolitan and sophisticated and urbane in ways that further marginalized them in Southern towns, which tended to be insular and parochial, regardless of their size. Intricately involved in the lives of their students and the Black community, where these colleges were located, these professors played a critical role as intellectual and spiritual guides into the post-World War classic civil rights movement, and especially college student agency in that movement. As faculty mentors, they played a major role in the intellectual growth of individual students and supported these students' ambition, sometimes prodding them into arenas even the students and their parents could not or did not envision. The students of these faculty relay heartfelt stories, some of which you will hear in the video, where they mention how these professors encouraged their ambitions and opened up new worlds of opportunity to them, such as a Fulbright scholarship and going to graduate school. Many of these students, remember, were still the first generation, not only to go to college, but if they were from the South, they were very often the first generation in their family to finish high school. Many refugee scholars, if not most, had children who identified or were identified by the white community as white, not Jewish, when they were in school, or at least culturally, the children had to be malleable and moving back and forth among different communities. They were in segregated white schools, but their parents worked on Black campuses and engaged the Black community and Black churches. The norm was to have a Christmas tree and a menorah and to attend compulsory chapel on campus during the week and then temple on Saturdays. Some of the Jewish scholars in Etchman's research left their positions in Southern Black schools because they could not bear to live in and raise their children in a world where everything in life was segregated, from the phone booths to the Bibles people swore on in court. Others simply didn't want to be at a Black college or in the South, or like many people in many jobs, they simply didn't get along with their colleagues, students, or the administration. But here is one compelling example of those family reasons for leaving. Professor Peter Kahn, upon his resignation from Hampton University in 1957, wrote to President Morin and said, and I quote, "Bringing up children in the South is more difficult than we had envisioned some years ago when we first came to the South. Both my wife and I hope fervently that we could in some small way help to make an integrated society possible. We have waited impatiently for some changes that have not taken place, neither outside nor right here on campus." And now I invite you to, for the next few minutes, to hear from some of the professors and their students about their experiences.
There was every day a blow, every day something new, every day a new decree, a new law, which of course in many cases was directed against Jews.
At the age of 15 or so, I had to drop out because of the kind of harassment that was faced there also. So by that time, I was a very convinced and opinionated rebel who was going to fight for justice.
having been cast out themselves from Europe, they could appreciate, as few others could, what it meant to be a pariah. And therefore, they took it upon themselves to participate in this enterprise of teaching in segregated institutions of higher learning.
Mississippi was so segregated, it's really hard to imagine. And in fact, Tougaloo College was called by white folks Cancer College because they saw it as a cancer on the Southern body politic, and I guess in a sense it was trying to destroy segregation as a system.
The sheriff that was all powerful in these small Southern communities knew everyone. They kept tabs on any outsider. If you had relatives visiting you with an out-of-state license plate, I mean, they were likely to come around and ask you or your neighbors, who's there? Who is this visiting out of town? It couldn't have been a lot worse under a kind of fascist regime.
I could assume that black people, black students had much more interest in and also much more understanding of movements like fascism and Nazism or racism, etc., and that it was therefore relatively easy to teach them something which may not have been as easy as that at a white college.
This notion of man's inhumanity to man was not foreign to African American citizens. And so, yes, I think there was not as much shock, perhaps, as it would be empathy, because when you've been through slavery, you're not shocked by anything that people will do.
Well, I think the heart of the story is the way the Jewish refugees and the blacks understood mutual racial terror and oppression, albeit from very different historical perspectives and histories. So there was a common understanding.
And we will begin to wrap up here before I hear your questions and comments. What I'd like to share with you is just what I see as the legacy of this history. These stories of empathy, salvation, and hope don't erase both past and present prejudices within both the Jewish and Black communities. Or as Edgecombe points out in her own work, the realities of some of the contentious spaces in the marketplace and in politics that divide the Black and Jewish communities. Those hostilities, we know, are just as real as the very close relationships we see being formed at these HBCUs. In their 2022 book, Blacks and Jews in America, An Invitation to Dialogue, Terrence Johnson and Jacques Berlin-de-Blau unpack the complexity of Black-Jewish relations and go deeper than these historic alliances and collaborations. And they talk about the fluidity of racial boundaries where Black people regard Jews as having white privilege, but at the same time, Jews aren't white. They talk about antagonistic power relationships and about the resonance of the Exodus story and Jews among Black people as enslaved, as all being enslaved and being liberated by God's providence. And they talk about the diversity within the Black community and within the Jewish communities, where we also find people who are Black and Jewish. And so they try to reveal just how complex these historic relationships have been, both on the side of collaborations, but also on the side of continued anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism. At an interfaith showing of the film with my African American church, St. Mark's United Methodist Church in Montclair, New Jersey, and B'nai Shalom Synagogue of West Orange, New Jersey, Rabbi Robert Tobin reminded us that we should neither forget this history of collaboration in the fight for social justice, nor should we allow its memory to serve as a substitute for fighting for and with each other in the pervasive contemporary struggles against social, economic, and political injustices. He reminded us that this history of collaboration in the fight for social justice does not and should not erase addressing the ways we still perpetuate stereotypes, racism, and prejudice in our own lives. And so, as the chronicler of Gabrielle Simon Edgecombe's research and stories of empathy and hope, I always ask my audiences to heed Rabbi Tobin's wise counsel. We must be attentive to serious challenges to empathy, salvation, redress, reconciliation, and hope. Edgecombe's research and her book do not reveal that it's actually easy to love, or easier to love than to hate, or easier to embrace than to reject, or easier to learn than to dismiss. Rather, she shows us how extraordinary and distinct it is when we enter foreign spaces and find that we do not lose ourselves, and instead we might find newer and better selves. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions that are in the chat.
Thank you so much, Lily. And I will indeed send something out to everybody who registered tomorrow with, and I'll include the clip so that people can see the visuals. Sometimes technology is our friend. Sometimes it's just
yeah, it only works in our run through before the presentation. It worked perfectly.
So I do have some questions, and I invite people to put their questions in the chat. So Yitzhak Kerem asks whether any of the Jewish professors took part in the civil rights movement.
Yes, they did. One of the most striking examples is Professor Ernst Berinsky at Talladega, Tougaloo College in Mississippi, where he actually created these kind of social studies workshops, seminars, and brought students from Ole Miss to Tougaloo. Yes, I see you, Sherry, thinking, what? Yes. Which was a dangerous and, of course, illegal thing to do. Had them sit in his tiny, cramped seminar room. Had the students seated black, white, every other seat, because he knew none of them had ever sat in a chair next to someone of a different race, which was illegal. And actually workshopped civil rights and social justice issues with those college students in the room. He was revolutionary in what he did at Tougaloo. And students who entered the movement talked about the ways in which his workshops inspired them to be brave, right? And their roles in the student movement. Yeah, he is the best example of that.
Right, thank you. So Rivka asks whether anybody has taken a look at non-German or non-Austrian Jewish refugees who taught at the historically Black colleges after World War II, noting that she was familiar with a dentist from Lithuania who ended up going to Howard University.
My guess is there may be some studies that I'm not aware of. I mean, one of the things we should realize is that for most of these HBCUs, from their founding, and regardless of who founded them, almost all, especially the private schools, all had white faculty, white presidents, white trustees and boards, especially those founded by white denominations, the Congregational Church, the Methodist Church, etc. And so the presence of white faculty would not have been at all unusual, which is why in some ways the distinctive part for these professors was that they were German. There's one clip where a former student is talking to a friend, And the friend says to him, well, Jews are black people. And the student says, no, they're not. Why would you think that? And the friend says to him, well, why else would Jews be treated so badly? Right? The kind of conflation of this is what, this is what discrimination looks like in America. And this is my only way of understanding it is in these two racial categories. And knowing that Jews are discriminated against, and therefore they must be in that black category.
Yeah. Thanks. So Susan asked if you could repeat the name of the professor at Tougaloo who invited students to the integrated workshop.
That's Ernst, E-R-N-S-T, if I'm spelling it correctly, Borinsky, B-O-R-I-N-S-K-I.
Thank you.
Borinsky, yes.
So Isabel Auerbach asks about the question of sort of mutual intelligibility, that the European professors who knew English were likely sort of had a more European or British orientation, and whether it was difficult for them to understand each other when they came to the American South.
Oh, they were German speakers. They did not speak English. If you recall, what in the American educational system in the 19th century into the early 20th century, the pinnacle of one's training, even if you had your PhD from some stellar US institution, the true finishing of your higher education was to go and study in Germany. And so in some ways we flipped the script so that well-educated Americans spoke not only Latin, maybe Greek, but they also spoke, read, studied in German, not the other way around. And so these professors are arriving with very, very little English at all, and had to learn the language very quickly. But almost all of them are also teaching German because it was part of the regular curriculum.
So folks can add if they have any additional questions. I had one, which is whether people had sort of interviewed students who were in colleges, especially during the 40s and 50s, and about the lasting impact for them of having these professors who had the experiences that they had.
There are, especially in the full-length documentary film, which is based on interviews with the faculty members and with their students, there are, just these inspiring stories about the relationship students have with their faculty members. Dr. Joyce Ladner talks about Professor Brinsky, number one, encouraging her to go to graduate school, which she had never thought about. And then he gives her the money for her application to go to graduate school. And she gets her doctorate. She says he is the first person she calls to tell him that she has received her degree. In the clip that I wanted to show you today, one of the students talks about going to a student meeting or student event at Morehouse. And so there are college students from HBCUs all going to Morehouse for an event. And he talks about the students in the audience talking about their Black professors. And he says he sits there feeling very awkward because the professor most important in his life was this German Jewish professor, was the one he was closest to. Another student tells a story about a professor telling him he should apply for a Fulbright. And he says, what's a Fulbright? And helping him fill out the application, and he gets a Fulbright. So there are all of these ways in which these professors as they learn an American style of teaching. Of course, their German style was extremely authoritarian and purely lecture, and students listen and professors talk. Um, they had to learn a different higher education culture, but they were very close to their students. I can't remember if it's in this clip, but one of my former professors from Oberlin, who, as I say to people who think it was only 51 professors, so why is this important? And someone did say that to me recently. And I pointed out to them, I asked them to think about how many students did that 51 teach? And what is the impact that those students are now having on other students, including my own professor at Oberlin College, who was mentored by one of these faculty members. So like I'm the granddaughter of this experience, right? And the ways in which some of them have made a lasting impression on these institutions. Victor Lowenfeld created the art department at Hampton that exists today. And so there are these kind of permanent institutional fixtures, as well as these transformative experiences that students had under the teaching and mentorship of these professors, which kind of have a infinite impact, right? In the ways in which they made a difference in the lives of their students.
Thank you. So we had a couple of questions about whether the film From Swastika to Jim Crow can be found online.
It is not online. It can be rented for showing. And what I would recommend, I mean, what one could do is to have a kind of community showing where maybe the what I would recommend is what we did in Montclair is have the Jewish Community Library maybe sponsor it and bring in some Black churches. I know some of the members of my congregation who attended had gone to HBCUs, and only in seeing the film thought, oh, I remember Professor Manasseh. And kind of we're talking about him in this film, but they thought of him as another professor on campus. And to do it as a kind of community event, I think would be, and to then facilitate discussion around the film.
We will take that idea very seriously. So thank you. I think we need to, I guess we do have a question if you want. That's so two things. So also somebody mentioned a film, The Life and Times of Jim McWilliams, which is about a civil rights lawyer who went to a Black college and was inspired and encouraged by Jewish refugee professors, which I'll see if I can find that as well. To conclude, somebody did have a question that's much more general, but maybe we want to end with, if you care to answer it, which is how do recent events with Black Lives Matter and anti-Semitic attacks reshape how we talk about solidarity and justice? And if you want, that's a big question, but if you want to maybe leave us with some thoughts about how we stand today.
Yeah, and we can include in that, obviously, the bombing of Black churches, synagogues, and the kind of the vigilante violence against Black and Jewish people as well. I think it requires us to engage in the kinds of collaborations that we saw evolve so powerfully in the 20th century, whether it was Julius Rosenwald's 5,000 school buildings and housing for Black schools and teachers, or the collaborations in the NAACP and the Legal Defense Fund. One of the lectures I give includes talking about Rosa Parks' husband and Samuel Leibowitz working on the Scottsboro trial. And most people think said to me, kind of, we've never heard anything about Rosa Parks' husband. um, um, and then, of course, the Rabbi Heschel and others in terms of the civil rights movement and being companions of Martin Luther King. Um, I think this is a moment in time to resurrect those kinds of collaborations, beginning with conversations, but then moving um, to social justice action in collaboration with each other. We know that the historical contexts of anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism are not the same. However, I think the manifestations of them are. The dehumanization of people looks the same to me, no matter who it may be. And that and what the one of the reasons I like the notion of empathy is because it says that your dehumanization dehumanizes me personally. And that I take on that pain, but I also take on the work to protect and to affirm everyone's humanity. And I think this is a time where that's necessary.
Thank you very much. And thank you for those words, for your presentation, which was wonderful. And thank you everybody for joining us. We will send something to folks tomorrow with additional resources, and we'll try to do more. We do have a program with I'll include that in, I think it's May 6th, with Mark Dollinger at the library, physically, about the Rabbi Heschel, Martin Luther King, and providing a sort of also a different perspective on those events that actually should be very special based on some recent research he's done. So
Howard, I also have a very short bibliography that I can share with you for your supporters as well, so I can send that to you for people who want to do some reading on their own.
Great, that's deeply appreciated. All right, well, thanks everybody. Have a good evening. And for those of you celebrating Passover this coming week, I wish you a sweet and meaningful Passover. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.